Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Valley podcast of your host, Jacob Bremen. I am joined once again by James Valliant, a frequent guest on the History Valley podcast, along with Derreck Bennett. He appeared once before on his channel. I'll have a link to that video and to his YouTube channel as well. Go check him out. I recommend it. I like his YouTube videos. I enjoy them. Okay, so today we're talking about dying rising gods. We all know, well, at least anybody that's studied this, knows that there are dying rising salvific savior gods that precede Christianity by centuries or thousands of years. There's a lot of people out there that say, oh, nah, not really. And others will say, oh, Horus has 12 disciples, and really bad examples of these comparisons as well. And we're going to talk about that today. I want to start off with actually talking about that last thing I just said there, the Horus thing. There's a lot of bad comparisons between Horus and Jesus, a lot of false similarities between the two. And isn't there more parallels with Osiris instead? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really odd things is why are you misdirecting us to Horus when it's his father, Osiris, who has the really striking parallels to Christ? It's like, why are we wasting any time on X when the father, hello, that's the one you should be looking at. I mean, there are some relatively vague, kind of superficial similarities between Horus and Jesus. They're both, Horus, in the end, he defeats Set. And so there's almost kind of you could almost say an eschatological element there in his, vanquishing the bad guy. But that's not super specific. That's a little bit more general. You find that in just about, I wouldn't say every ancient religion, but in many of them. So there is in Diodorus Siculus, 1st century BC, there's the mention of Isis actually resurrecting Horus. He dies, I think, from poisoning, and she uses some kind of potion to restore him back to life. But it's the only mention I know of regarding Horus having any kind of restoration to life, resurrection. I don't know. I don't know how widespread or common that belief was. So I'm right with you in that, yeah, why are we paying any attention to Horus? His father Osiris, oh my goodness. The parallels are so striking and so numerous that to say that it's just mere coincidence seems to be a bit of a stretch.
Well, one of the things that Christian apologists will often say is, well, so many of these gods, we don't know that they had a physical resurrection. In Osiris's case, it couldn't be more explicitly a physical resurrection. His dismembered body is literally put back together some kind of Dr. Frankenstein way by Isis. Can't find, of course, the most important part, the one part that's left out, which of course has mystical significance as a regenerative god and so forth. But in any event, he specifically enjoys a physical resurrection. And furthermore, don't we have inscriptions that indicate that the followers of Osiris themselves believed that their own afterlife could be a better place and assured a better immortality and so forth in their own worship of this physically resurrected deity?
Yeah, their individual resurrection was dependent upon his resurrection. Now, in the beginning, this only applied to the pharaoh.
Right.
It was just for the kings. But later on, I think by the New Kingdom, it had been democratized to
By the Bronze Age.
Yeah,
like more than 1,000 years before Christ.
Right. Now, as to whether his resurrection is physical or spiritual, I mean, it's in the pyramid texts and in many of these ancient Egyptian texts, it most certainly is. But it also depends on what time and place, what text you're reading. For instance, in Plutarch, it does sound, I think Ehrman's right, it does sound like it's probably more of a spiritual type resurrection, that his body remains in the tomb. But of course, we're getting this from a middle Platonist, Plutarch,
Late
that's the way
first
he's
century
naturally
writer,
going to
yeah.
interpret it. Right.
Roman
So
era writer.
you have to understand that there's variation in all of these myths. There was variation in early Christianity, even variation concerning how his resurrection was conceived. So what the apologists will do is they'll cherry pick an instance where, no, this is just a spiritual thing, and they'll completely disregard everything else that absolutely points to a physical resurrection.
What an
And I'm
excellent,
sick of it.
what an excellent point, because in the New Testament itself, Jesus has both an empty tomb, wounds that his disciple Thomas can touch, but on the other hand, he's walking through walls. So dudes with physical bodies don't normally walk through walls and make sudden miraculous appearances and so forth. So and Paul appears to have no physical resurrection tradition, whatever, whereas the Gospels at least are pointing us in that direction. So even Christianity is mixed in its tradition just as much as the Osiris story is. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, even with Paul, it's something, believe it or not, I actually agree with N.T. Wright when he describes it as being transphysical, but whatever it is, it doesn't have flesh like you and I have now. 1 Corinthians 15:50, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor can the perishable inherit the imperishable. It may be something quasi-physical, right? The pneuma or whatever, but it's not what we have now, whereas Luke and John are bringing it more in line with what the body that we do have now, but though it's still a supernatural body that can pass through walls. So there is some congruence, but there's still a screaming contradiction between Paul and Luke on this point. So yes, the story is evolving and changing as we come down the decades, absolutely.
And there had to be some significance to an enduring physical body, as the Egyptians famously mummified, but even Jews, unlike Romans and Greeks, didn't burn and collect ashes so much as they preserved bodies, and even when they were bones, they put them in ossuaries. So there's a physical preservation in both the Egyptian and Jewish tradition that there isn't, say, in the Greco, or at least so much as there is in the Greco-Roman tradition. There's a famous story in Homer, of course, when Odysseus goes down to the underworld, tries to embrace his mother, and woof, she's just a cloud, and he can't really embrace her, and oh, how sad. He can't embrace his dead mother in the afterlife. So it seems that Greco-Roman ideas of an afterlife were a spiritual ghost-like thing, say, vis-a-vis the Egyptian or Jewish model, in which the physical preservation of the body is important. But we also have, as I say, this Osiris myth in which it's important to piece his body for some reason back together.
Well, it all depends. Again, it depends on what text you're reading, who the author is, what time they're, even in the Greco-Roman world. Yes, you have the Platonic idea of the spirit or soul being released from the prison of the body. But one of the points that Enzo in Resurrection or what's the name of the title of the book? I think it's Greek Resurrection Beliefs and the Success of Christianity, where he talks about, yes, this was among the elite, among the philosophers, this Platonic disembodiment was the preferred idea of immortality. But among the commoners, as we're able to more or less extrapolate from some of these authors, the idea was something more along the lines of what Paul is talking about. It's still the physical body, but it's transformed into some kind of pneumatic body. So if you're talking about Romulus, his body disappears. You have the apotheosis, the bodily disappearance, precisely because his body has been taken up and transformed for immortal life. With the Asclepius, Celsus, not Celsus, no, it is Celsus. Celsus tells us the Greeks and barbarians alike saw no mere phantom, but Asclepius himself,
right,
doing good deeds, predicting the future. Who else? Aristeas, on one of his many returns to Sicily, he actually sits down and writes a poem. It's kind of hard to do that if you're a mere ghost, So what you find is that what Paul is talking about is very much in keeping with Greco-Roman ideas about immortality, especially as it concerned a divine being. I mean, divinity and immortality went hand in hand, and you weren't going to be a god without some kind of glorious, empowered body.
Absolutely astonishing. One of the things I find, first I want to echo as a preface to this question, even what Jacob said. You're always extremely informative. I highly recommend people check out your videos. Please consider becoming a subscriber. Really, this is important stuff and great stuff every time.
A Theologica.
So please, please, please look at Derreck Bennett's work. A recent essay appeared in an important anthology that just came out on mythicism as well. I highly recommend Derreck's work. One of the things that you do point out in your brilliant work is that not only do Christian apologists come along with it, well, this idea has been discounted, any comparison is obviously insane, and they accuse us of actually saying that that Jesus was specifically modeled on some specific God. That's not the idea at all, of course. It was just the idea in the general milieu of religions about at the time. But more than that, they'll go so far as to say, it's been refuted. Scholars no longer consider this. No serious scholar will address this. And it seems to me far from that. Lots of scholars have not only continued the idea, but advanced the idea and increased and sophisticated our understanding of it.
The claim you often hear is that this stuff stems from the late 19th and 20th century, scholars from that period. It's since then been refuted, and nobody but a few crazies are talking about this. Well, there's an element of truth to this, okay? It is true that in 1987, Jonathan Z. Smith wrote his famous Dying and Rising Gods article, which was published in Mircea Eliade's Encyclopedia of Religion. He very much it was basically almost a root and branch of James George Fraser's ideas. J.Z. Smith, great scholar that he was, is sort of the new James George Fraser, and he's going to set things right. And a lot of scholars did follow in his wake and say, okay, Smith says this, that's where we're going. But to say that just completely vanquished the idea and no one's discussing it or taking it seriously anymore is completely false. I mean, in that same year, 1987, Marvin Meyer, great scholar of Greek New Testament, he translated the Gnostic Gospels, came out with the Ancient Mysteries, a source book of sacred texts, and he actually addresses the very kinds of arguments that Jonathan Z. Smith was making. And he says, this is dubious and it has an apologetic slant to it. He's not addressing Smith specifically, but he's talking precisely about the kind of arguments that Smith had made. And ever since then, I mean, let's put it this way, the most recent monograph on the topic is John Granger Cook's Empty Tomb Resurrection Apotheosis, which came out just a few years ago in 2018. And it's more comprehensive than what Medinger did back in 2001. And here he absolutely affirms the use of dying and rising gods as a label to describe the vicissitudes of various of these divinities based on, I mean, he goes, it's a 700+ page tome, and he goes into detail on each and every one of these divinities, the dying rising gods, the apotheosized heroes, you name it. It's extremely detailed. So I mean, that tells you right there that this is something that has been completely debunked and is no longer taken seriously. It's just plain false. And you'll find a number of modern scholars talking about this very thing. Legitimate scholars, not hacks, actual legitimate scholars, from John Day to John Levinson. I mean, it's
so far from ignored or refuted. There are numerous writers who are still very interested in it, including
they didn't get the memo.
Respected writers.
Yes.
Okay, so that's just wrong.
Yeah. They are inflating the claim.
Right. Because it does seem strange that, for example, we have these, you know, it goes back to C.S. Lewis's, I guess, Mere Christianity and his claim. Why would anyone deify someone who had been martyred, died in some humiliating way? And how could some crucified man, someone who had been cruelly executed or murdered, ever become a god? Well, that simple fact, of course, is just plain insane. So many of the deified heroes who enjoy apotheoses in pagan religion enjoy, or not enjoy, suffer is the proper word, horrific dismemberments, executions of various kinds, punishments. Asclepius, the healer god, is so good. He's semi-divine. His mother's mortal. His father's a divinity. He not only is a healer god, he resurrects people. This vexes the gods. They zap him in punishment. His father says, please make him a god. He becomes a god. Just the story of Heracles or Hercules. He suffers labors on earth. He suffers. His martyrdom is horrific at the funeral pyre, tearing off the burning clothes that tear off his flesh. So he suffers a horrific death. Both of those figures had numerous temples in the ancient world, and yet they suffered horrific punishment deaths or horrible executions on earth. And those are just two, not to mention the earlier dismemberment of Osiris, the lord of the underworld. I mean, here he is being ripped apart into shreds. Or Zagreus, Orpheus, on and on and on. A myth about Dionysus, on and on and on.
And you're not going to say, oh, a divinity who died some horrific death, I want nothing to do with that. No, that brings it down to the human sphere. It helps us relate to and identify with the gods. It brings them closer to us. It tells us that if there can be hope, for a divinity, then perhaps by being assimilated with them, particularly in the mystery religions, we can hope to overcome death as they did, that through some kind of imitatio Dei or whatever. But even outside of the mystery religions, that's what brings the gods in closer relation to us who do suffer and experience death and humiliation.
It's precisely the same psychology, though, as Christianity has as a religion.
Right.
In other words, this is a common human psychology to have. Of course, we can expect ancient religions, especially in this philosophical view, to have it.
Love those gods even more.
Right. It humanizes them. It makes the god relatable to. It makes my own death less frightening because this god overcame the death. Of course, it makes them human. It makes them mortal, like we are.
Right.
And it's precisely their mortality and their death that gives the devotee hope in a better afterlife.
And as it relates to Christianity in particular, you've got to understand, I mean, this is right in the vein of the article that I just put out on Patreon. Judaism and its holy texts are replete with these lamentation and suffering type psalms, and you find this in the prophets, in Isaiah, in Jeremiah. This was part and parcel of Judaism, to have a suffering type figure who overcomes that and is redeemed in some way. I mean, that right there laid the foundation. You already had a template through which to interpret the death of Christ, so that you see it as a victory, not as a setback. And it was all too easy for them to formulate this idea that, like the psalmist, he's now at God's right hand in the heavenly realms. It's a victory. It's something he's overcome. They're not going to run away from this.
Just
no.
like the jihadist terrorists will have their 72 virgins in the afterlife. Oh, sacrifice your whole life right now. Kill yourself here on earth. But believe me, we've got virgins out there waiting for you, right? So it's the same basic idea. But you're absolutely right. Isaiah himself, his suffering servant, is perhaps the model most frequently cited. But he will cite this innocent being who is falsely accused, executed for the transgressions of the people, but he is what makes the people. His, in effect, human sacrifice, and interestingly, he's silent when accused, just like Jesus at his trial in some of the gospel accounts, which appear to be directly modeled on Isaiah's suffering servant. In any case, that parallel aside, even as old as Isaiah, Jewish thinkers are saying that no, just because some innocent guy suffers isn't necessarily a negative thing at all, but the redemption of Israel that makes us prepared for the messianic advent.
Right. You can trace it as far back as Hosea, even prior to Isaiah.
One of the most early Hebrew literature.
In the 8th century BC, chapter 6. And where does Hosea get some of his ideas? Well, that gets really interesting. That's what my next video will be about.
Oh.
So I don't want to give too much away.
No real spoilers.
Things tend to come full circle in a very interesting way. But yeah, suffice it to say, when it comes to Christian apologists, it's just willful ignorance. Are you reading your own text? Do you understand your own Bible? Are you not, the mind games they have to play in order to set forth this kind of pretense that, oh, well, this is something so, N.T. Wright is a perfect example. His argument is a false trilemma with false premises. It's both unsound and invalid. This idea that, well, nobody expected an individual resurrection prior to the eschatological resurrection of the masses, as if nobody in the ancient world was capable of modifying pre-existing ideas or traditions. And in fact, that's just wrong. We know from Mark that it says that Herod wondered if John the Baptist was already, wondered if Jesus was John the Baptist raised from the dead.
Right.
So it was conceivable. And if you look at the significance of Christ's resurrection in early Christianity, he is what? The first fruits of those to be raised from the dead. There's a direct tie-in with the eschatological resurrection of the dead. It was a way of saying, hey, look, because they're expecting this imminently. They're under a lot of pressure with Rome. This is a way of saying, guys, it's coming. It's just around the corner. Look, someone's already done it. Someone's already done it. He is the first fruits. We are soon to follow. It ties in directly with the eschatology. And then, of course, the other side of N.T. Wright's argument is that just what we were talking about, nobody in the Greco-Roman world ever envisioned a physical resurrection, which, again, if you look at what Paul's describing, it lines up perfectly with what many of the commoners in the Greco-Roman world believed about the gods, demigods, kings, and heroes. So Wright's just wrong on all fronts. It's like fractal wrongness.
How many ways and angles can he be wrong?
Yeah, it's
questionable from numerous angles, yes.
And many apologists are still following his lead and thinking that this is a good argument, and it's not.
Plainly not. Yeah, plainly not. Yeah, the thing is, too, picking up on one of your points you make there, the idea of a final eschatological judgment did not mean that Jews did not think that there could be all sorts of messianic earthly king figures in the meantime. Joshua had been, David had been, the Maccabees had been, our Jewish rebels of the first century. Their rebel leaders surely had to have been claimant Messiah kings. And the mere fact, and multiple messiahs, all you have to do is read the Dead Sea Scrolls. They expect a leadership of, in effect, a kingly Messiah and a priestly Messiah. Two anointed one messiahs, in effect. So as we're awaiting this final eschatological judgment of the dead, and that's another interesting point, even within purely Jewish thought, at least some people, if we read Daniel right, are fully expecting a resurrection of souls at the end, and how did Josephus put it as he's describing it, a resurrection of the dead and rewards and punishments at the end of time. Well, that's exactly, Jewish and Christian eschatology. But the idea that there could be messiahs, earthly messiahs in the meantime, is totally not contradicted by that. In fact, that seems to be the standard Jewish expectation.
Right. And neither can you make Judaism, ancient Judaism even, a monolith. There was a variety of beliefs.
Right.
In fact, there were many Jews who actually bought into the Hellenistic, more Platonic conception of immortality. Philo of Alexandria, the Essenes, the Therapeutae. Giza Vermeij goes into this on the resurrection, history and myth. He has a chapter devoted to talking about these ancient sarcophagi,
right?
How many of them actually depict it's the soul leaving the body. By this time, Jews had been so Hellenized that many of them were accepting the idea of soul survival.
Well, see, we're used to contemporary Jews who mostly reject any afterlife. We're also used to the idea of sort of pre-Daniel Judaism, which didn't have, you can search the Torah high and low, there's no afterlife, right? And you really have to wait for later Jewish literature like Daniel to suggest a resurrection of the dead. But Josephus in the 1st century describes 2 of the 3 divisions of Jews as believing in the resurrection of the dead, both the Essenes and the Pharisees. And so either from Persia or from Greek ideas, they had accepted the idea of an afterlife. Major Jewish groups in the 1st century, we can only imagine most Jews of the 1st century, by Philo and Josephus's descriptions, believed in a kind of afterlife or resurrection of the dead of some form. And as you point out, people in the Gospels asked, is John the Baptist Elijah resurrected? And Herod believes, Jesus, are you John the Baptist? Wait. So there's also a notion not just of resurrection, but even maybe of reincarnation, the re-embodiment of these old figures from Hebrew literature.
Right. So the point is, you cannot generalize about any of these specific groups as N.T. Wright does. M. David Litwood takes him to task on this as well in Isus Deus, the early Christian depiction of Jesus as a Mediterranean god. He absolutely annihilates N.T. Wright in his chapter discuss.
I think we can see there are grounds to question N.T. Wright.
If I were N.T. Wright and I read this, I'd crawl in a hole for a couple of
Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, you had a variety of beliefs among Jews. You had a variety of beliefs among Greeks and Romans. You cannot generalize any of these. And you have a variety of ideas within the New Testament itself.
Obviously, none of the Gospels could agree on all of the details, and each of them seems to have its own, at least partially distinct theological perspective. People who say, well, the Christianity was invented in the 4th century. I can't really believe that. Why would you invent 4 Gospels that have such different perspectives and differ on so many details and are clearly trying to respond to one another? You would invent that sort of thing. So clearly, from the outset, almost, there had to be some really distinct differences among Christians to explain the differences between, say, Paul and each of the gospel writers. There
is also a popular historical conspiracy theory that's floating around on YouTube in tandem with the Nicene conspiracy theory, the Nicene origins of Christianity, that Jesus was a title given by the Council of Nicaea to Ptolemy Soter, because the adherents of that theory believe that Ptolemy, the first Soter, the first European pharaoh of Egypt, is actually Jesus.
Well, he had some of the titles, and I think it's hard to ignore that some of the titles, especially Jesus was given, don't come from Roman emperors.
James, I wouldn't even give them that much of an edge, because soter, Greek word for savior, for those I don't know, does not mean that anybody of that title is somehow Jesus.
No, neither Jesus nor yet a Jewish anointed one, a Messiah.
Right. But that's their logic.
Well, look. If Hellenistic kings and Roman emperors were given titles like savior, it makes good sense. They were sent by the gods to save the people, and so they're great kings. They're saviors of the people.
Yeah.
If they claim to be the children of gods, then Son of God would be another title that many of them would take, and they took. And those 2 are common titles for Jesus to have.
I just wanted to express. I didn't
But
mean
just
to
a lot of
interrupt.
these Greek titles may come from these Hellenistic or Roman gods
Right.
and kings or emperors, and were later applied to Jesus. One of the things that Derek has pointed out, lovely, he'll quote Ovid and Virgil on how the apotheoses of the Julians are compared to the language used at the crucifixion and apotheosis of Jesus. The earth trembles, the sky goes dark, his spirit is said to ascend. I mean, my goodness, it's almost as if the people describing the death and apotheosis of Jesus were inspired by these earlier Roman writers about the apotheosis of Roman emperors.
Yeah. That's another thing where, you often hear apologists argue that Jews were so, they found pagan ideas, Greco-Roman ideas so abhorrent that they would never stoop so low. Never.
We have Philo and Josephus. How can they think that? But we really have Philo and Josephus, who couldn't be more Hellenized, more deeply influenced, trying to integrate Greek ideas and Jewish ideas explicitly in the first century, no less.
There is a fine distinction to be made between going out of your way to worship the other gods.
Oh,
right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
There's a fine distinction between that and absorbing or inheriting theological ideas and motifs.
Exactly.
And then
oh no, Philo would tell you he's a good Jew. Oh no, Philo would tell you he's a monotheistic Jew. He is defending the tradition of Moses and the Jewish people, but he is lording it with Stoic and Platonic philosophy. If you're familiar with Greek philosophy, you know just how drenched Philo is in it.
Yeah. I mean, he's talking about ideas like rebirth and immortality of the soul. I mean, he almost sounds like he's a mystery religion initiate, but
himself.
Not necessarily, but it's certainly
he's a Platonic dualist. He's a Stoic in his
and he has the second and he has the second man theology, which is identical to the second Adam. And
Logos made flesh, and Logos with God at the creation. Philo's got so much that we find in the New Testament.
The word manifested in the flesh.
By the way,
it's not a matter of worshiping the pagan gods. Yeah. It's a matter of incorporating ideas, motifs,
precisely,
and applying them to your God, and then you're not doing anything wrong.
And
then
we absolutely
you're engaging in competitive assimilation.
And we absolutely know that important Jewish writers in the first century were assimilating Greek ideas like crazy, Philo and Josephus. And I mean, proud of their assimilation of Platonic and Stoic ideas.
There's even Jewish dualists that wrote texts like Third Enoch, that Metatron is the lesser Yahweh.
You're getting all kinds of funky syncretisms too.
Yeah.
Some people who are interested in Judaism and are mixing it with other ideas, and you're getting, as Derek points out, you can't look at Jews as a monotheistic bloc, for one thing. You've got Jews who are very Hellenized and deeply influenced by Greek ideas, and then you've got probably, it is true that as monotheists, even as old as the conquest of Alexander the Great, there were Jewish groups who were culturally resisting the overwhelming influence of Greek culture after the conquest of Alexander. And they were probably the one ethnic group that tried the hardest. The Egyptians and the Syrians and the Babylonians, they caved to huge Greek influence, and you can see it in their architecture, art, and literature. With the Jews, you can also detect a resistance. Yes. And the explanation of the Hanukkah revolt, the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century BC, is just that, trying. But you see, even in Maccabean literature, you see influences of Hellenistic ideas in literature. So even these guys trying to keep out and revolting against the Seleucid Hellenists, they themselves were to some degree, and to varying degrees, being influenced by Hellenistic ideas, even the resistors of the Hellenistic ideas. So
I'm glad you brought that up, because that is an important point to acknowledge. You did absolutely have more conservative Jews who were trying to resist this stuff. And that's what, the Maccabean revolt, all of that is, but even in like 2nd Maccabees, he's lamenting an increase in Hellenization and the adoption of foreign ways. He's complaining because precisely that kind of thing is happening. And it's like you said, even when they're trying to resist this stuff, they can't help but incorporate it. As John Day so beautifully explains in Yahweh and the Gods and Goddesses of Canaan, the way polemic operates. When you're doing polemics, that doesn't mean you completely avoid any ideas that your opponent is. No.
Your opponent's ideas are seeping in. Yes.
Incorporate the ideas of your opponents so as to use against them.
Exactly. As so every good arguer knows, you'll try and use the other guy's ideas yourself against him. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so to various degrees, even the Jewish resistors were being influenced by foreign ideas. And if you think about it, it's sort of historically inevitable as cultures interact.
It's completely inevitable. It's everything we know about the human condition tells us that this is what happens.
Now there could be surprising juxtapositions. I mean, it does seem to me strange, for example, traditional rabbinic Judaism, which sort of has its birth with Yavne and Yohanan ben Zakkai, or at least it's beginning at this time in a formal way, they start to de-emphasize Messiah as a concept. And you could begin to see why. It's political survival in the wake of the Jewish war. There are good political reasons why the concept of Messiah, which both pagan and Jewish historians say was the principal cause of the Jewish war. I mean, Josephus says it's these messianic prophecies that most motivated the people to cause the Jewish war, and it's Tacitus and Suetonius who say it. So pagan and Jewish writers say it's these messianic prophecies. And these rebel leaders in the first century do look like claimant kings, claimant messiahs. And they're expecting these rebels are expecting an earthly messiah and an earthly victory over Rome. They're taking it to war, baby. They mean it. And so this conception of Messiah becomes more spiritualized even in rabbinic Judaism. With Jesus, it becomes his kingdom is not even of this earth, according to the Gospel of John. You had a totally misunderstanding of what Messiah meant, and y'all Jews, you killed him, and look at the punishment you get. And that's sort of the theme of the Gospels, right? So the idea that people don't have a complex understanding of martyrdom itself, or that these religions are hermetically sealed from one another and not being influenced by one another, is absolutely nuts. We have to think of both of these things in just exactly the opposite direction. There may be paradoxical things like, what is a messianic form of Judaism doing, becoming so pacifistic as Christianity? But there, it may not be a paradox, but a causal connection. It's precisely because we were so militant and sectarian and nationalist, we got it wrong, so we need to switch on that aspect, but we're not going to let go of this Messiah idea or some future eschatological Jesus. And I think we have to understand humans are complex beings who are going to psychologically think like that, especially on the eve of a Jewish war, in the wake of a Jewish war. If you ask me, is it a historical coincidence that Christianity emerged at precisely the same time there was a messianic, religiously motivated war between the Jews and the Romans? No. That can be no mere coincidence of history. The only question in my mind is the nature of the causation between the cataclysmic wars. And interesting, most Christian literature was written between the two Jewish wars. Between 66, say, and 135 AD, you have the majority of the earliest Christian literature being written. And so you're telling me that it's right at this time when the vast majority of Messianic Jews are involved in a giant war that reduces their temple to a wailing wall, that causes the legal diaspora of the Jews to begin. Jews are expelled and so forth. That messianically caused conflict between cultures has nothing to do with Christianity, which appears to be a blend, a crashing of these two cultures together. It cannot be an accident, can it? In fact, the New Testament appears to be a critical response to the rebels. Render unto Caesar, blessed are the peacemakers, love your enemy, go the extra mile for the Romans. My kingdom is not of this earth. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Mark 13 and the apocalyptic destruction, the prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem, is a dire warning against rebellion. written after the fact, of course, but a dire in its details, it can't be, in my mind, anything but written 70 of the earliest, but the Mark 13, but it's still a dire warning against rebellion. Jesus says, whoever picks up a sword shall die by the sword. That's weird. People who use swords will die of natural causes every day. And so literally it's a bizarre thing to say, but in the context of war, it makes perfect sense. Whoever picks up a sword, you see, will die by the sword. He's predicting a grim outcome to the Jewish war. When he befriends tax collectors and praises a centurion's faith is above any Jew, when the passion narratives stand on their head to exonerate the Romans and blame the Jews collectively, which all four Gospels stand on their head to do in fictional ways, then the very story of Jesus seems to me to be a rhetorical answer to the Jewish rebels. If that's the case, then what we're looking at clearly is a critical response to the rebels, written in their own messianic Jewish terms, but with an upside-down, inside-out philosophy from their own nationalist, Torah orthodox, sectarian, militant version of Messianic Judaism. Now it is a non-nationalist, internationalist, non-sectarian, Jews and Greeks and slaves and pro-peace and Torah critical. And all these elements can be seen even in Paul and only amplified in the Gospels. So it seems to me that the New Testament is a critical, and I want to get your response to this, Derek. The New Testament seems to me, at least from the 30,000 foot elevation, given its time, its place, what it says, to be a direct critical response to the Messianic Jewish rebels of the first two wars.
It may well be. This is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. Because I deal primarily in comparative religion, more so than the actual history, the actual historical events and undercurrents. It's not to say that I don't pay any attention to that stuff. It's just that's not my strong suit as much as the delving into the actual the mythologies, philosophies, the prevalent ideas of the time. But when I listen to you discuss this stuff, I mean, I tend to agree, and I see Christianity also as precisely the kind of religion you would expect to come out of the ashes of these events, in a way that is strikingly similar to other prophetic or doomsday type cults, where something momentous was expected to occur and it didn't. So an excellent analogy here would be the Millerites, I think 18th or 19th century. I think maybe
in the 19th century, they had the exact date.
So they're expecting the second coming of Jesus.
Yes, and they had the date, baby. They'd figured it out, and with the geometrical logic, so they'd proved it beyond a shadow of doubt in their own mind.
Beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Right.
Long story short, I mean, they gather on this mountainside. They go to witness this event, and that following day, or that very evening, I think, they all come walking down from the hillside with their heads hanging low, feeling pretty sheepish, feeling pretty embarrassed. So then, as the apologists would have us believe, the movement just died out, right? Because, completely embarrassed, completely humiliated.
They admitted they were wrong. It's all over.
And we've never heard of it.
Up their shop. They close shop. No, don't expect them. Most of them are going to hang tough with this shit.
They exist today as the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They're still
yes, the church is still with us today.
They're still here.
I was telling Joel Pearson the other day this Monty Python joke that is perfect for this. They have a Monty Python skit, and it's a spoof. It's a talk show. One guy comes out and he says, "My claim is that I wrote all of Shakespeare's plays, and my wife and I wrote all of his sonnets." To which the intrepid interviewer says, "Well, how can you then account for the fact that Shakespeare's plays were known to have been performed 300 years before your birth?" After a short pause, the guy says, I can see you're much too clever for me. That is where my theory falls to the ground. You cannot expect the Millerites to be that honest and simply say, okay, we were wrong. I guess the whole thing is BS, and so we have to start from scratch. No.
But they're not an isolated instance.
They're not an isolated instance.
Again and again and again.
You're not going to take away
something.
that. You're not going to take away their basic religious views.
No.
They're still Messianic Jews. They're just going to have to modify their specific expectations to meet the new realities.
Right. That's precisely what they do. So they're expecting this stuff imminently. I mean, you can tell reading Paul.
Something big is going to happen with Paul any day now.
It's
and he's expecting something earthly to big, and it's not sure whether it's the same thing, but also an eschatological thing is going to happen. But something big is going to happen. It's going to happen soon with Paul.
Because by God, we need it to happen soon.
We need it to happen.
We need this to happen.
Yeah.
There are some of you standing here who will not taste death before you see the Son of Man.
Exactly. They needed it to happen and happen relatively soon.
Yeah. And it doesn't happen.
And it does
not happen.
We have from Josephus actually people who'd predicted that, at least in the immediate years, maybe not as old as Jesus, but evidence there were Jews predicting the destruction of Jerusalem in the years immediately before the war. Can you imagine looking back on that, and you're a Jew and you got it all wrong, or your Messiah failed? Suddenly, yeah, you're still a Messianic Jew, but your own Messianic expectations failed, and you hear that there was this guy who predicted it all. Imagine the psychologies going on in the people at that exact moment in history. I think something like Christianity is quite expectable indeed.
Yeah, they don't just ditch the belief.
No, you don't.
Just ditch the
belief. Your whole religion isn't going to be thrown in the ash can, no matter how cataclysmic the event. Right.
We just start reinterpreting. That's what.
So we just got the interpretation of this event wrong, but our basic religious views are going to stay mostly the same. Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's, Christianity is a fascinating glimpse into the events leading up to this, in the Pauline corpus and so forth.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.